On the morning of June 19, 1944, Vice Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa stood on the bridge of Japan's newest aircraft carrier, Taiho, and prepared to deliver the decisive blow that would turn the tide of the Pacific War. His fleet carried 9 carriers and over 400 aircraft. His pilots had trained specifically for this moment. His plan exploited every advantage Japanese naval aviation possessed. The Americans would be caught between his carrier strikes from the west and land-based aircraft attacking from Guam to the east by nightfall. He believed the United States Pacific Fleet would be crippled and Japan would negotiate peace from a position of strength. Ozawa was a tall man for a Japanese officer of his generation, standing over 6 feet and nicknamed Gargoyle by his subordinates for his stern, angular features. He had commanded carriers since 1942 and understood both their power and their vulnerability. He believed he had planned for every contingency. He had not. 300 miles to the east, aboard the battleship USS Alabama, a 23-year-old radar operator named Clifford O'Brien was watching a green phosphorescent screen in the ship's Combat Information Center. The SK radar he monitored was a marvel of American electronics engineering. Its massive bed-spring antenna, measuring 15 by 17 feet, was mounted over 100 feet above the waterline. The system could detect aircraft formations at ranges exceeding 100 miles, distances that would have seemed impossible just 3 years earlier when radar was still an experimental technology. At 6 minutes 10 that morning, O'Brien detected something that made him immediately alert his supervisor. Faint blips were appearing at the extreme edge of his display. Enemy aircraft, dozens of them, then scores. They were still over 140 miles away, far beyond visual range, heading straight for the American fleet at approximately 150 miles per hour. O'Brien's report went up the chain of command within seconds. Vice Admiral Willis Lee, commanding the battle line from USS Washington, requested confirmation from other ships. USS Iowa's radar operators verified the contact independently. The detection was real. The largest Japanese carrier strike since Pearl Harbor was inbound, and the Americans had been given nearly 30 minutes of warning to prepare their response. Ozawa believed his pilots would achieve surprise. O'Brien's radar had just made surprise impossible. The Japanese commander was about to learn how catastrophically he had misjudged his enemy. The miscalculation began long before the first aircraft launched. In the years following their stunning victories at Pearl Harbor, Wake Island, the Philippines, and across Southeast Asia, Japanese naval planners had developed a comprehensive strategy for the decisive fleet battle they believed would determine the war's outcome. They called it Operation Ago. The plan depended on assumptions about Japanese strengths and American weaknesses that had once been true, but were true no longer. Japanese carrier aircraft possessed significantly greater range than their American counterparts. A Japanese Nakajima B-6N Tenzan torpedo bomber could fly 300 miles to its target and return. An American Grumman TBF Avenger could manage perhaps 250 miles. This difference meant Japanese carriers could theoretically strike from beyond the range at which American aircraft could counterattack. Ozawa planned to exploit this advantage with ruthless precision. He would launch his aircraft at maximum range, watch them devastate the American carrier fleet, then recover them safely while remaining beyond the reach of American retaliation. The plan contained another element that seemed to guarantee decisive success. Ozawa expected approximately 500 land-based aircraft from Vice Admiral Kakuji Kakuta's First Air Fleet to attack the Americans from airfields on Guam, Rotor, and Yap in the Mariana Islands. According to the operational plan, these land-based aircraft would destroy roughly 1/3 of the American carriers before Ozawa's fleet even engaged. Then his carrier aircraft would employ a shuttle bombing technique, striking the Americans and landing on Guam to refuel and rearm, rather than returning directly to the carriers. This would allow multiple strikes per day while conserving aviation fuel aboard the carriers. The concept promised to multiply Japanese striking power far beyond what carrier aircraft alone could deliver. Japanese intelligence officers compiled detailed reports on American capabilities that reinforced Ozawa's confidence in the operational plan. The Americans possessed more ships, more aircraft, more industrial capacity than Japan could ever match. But quantity, Japanese strategists firmly believed, could not compensate for quality in naval warfare. Japanese pilots were warriors descended from a martial tradition stretching back centuries to the samurai. American pilots were mere technicians who depended on their machines rather than their fighting spirit. When steel met spirit in combat, spirit would prevail, as it had at Tsushima against the Russians in 1905. Admiral Soemu Toyota, commander of the combined fleet, shared this absolute confidence in Japanese superiority. Before Operation Ago commenced, he issued a fleet order explicitly invoking the memory of Admiral Heihachiro Togo's legendary victory over the Russian Baltic Fleet at Tsushima nearly 40 years earlier. The fate of the empire rests on this one battle, Toyota declared, in language designed to inspire his men to supreme effort. Every man shall do his utmost. But the assumptions underlying Operation Ago had already collapsed completely, and Ozawa sailed toward battle without knowing it. American carrier task forces under Vice Admiral Marc Mitscher had conducted devastating raids on the Mariana Islands between June 11th and 15th. Hellcat fighters had swept over Guam, Saipan, Rotor, and Tinian in the Mariana Islands, destroying Japanese aircraft on the ground and shooting down those that rose to challenge them. Anti-aircraft positions were bombed.
Hangars were burned. Fuel dumps exploded. Of the 500 aircraft Ozawa confidently expected to support his operation, fewer than 50 remained operational by the time his fleet approached. Vice Admiral Kakata, commanding the decimated First Air Fleet, either through catastrophic miscommunication or unwillingness to admit the magnitude of his failure, never accurately reported these losses to Ozawa. Messages between the two commanders were vague about precise aircraft numbers. Ozawa interpreted ambiguous reports optimistically. He sailed toward the decisive battle, believing he commanded robust land-based air support that no longer existed in any meaningful sense. The Japanese pilots themselves presented an even more fundamental problem that Ozawa's planning had not adequately addressed. They were not the warriors their predecessors had been. At Pearl Harbor in December 1941, the average Japanese naval aviator had accumulated approximately 700 hours of flight time before entering combat. These were elite professionals who had trained for years under the most rigorous selection and instruction programs in the world. They could navigate across thousands of miles of open Pacific Ocean using only dead reckoning and occasional star fixes. They could place torpedoes with devastating accuracy against maneuvering warships at high speed. They were masters of their craft, and their skill had won Japan an empire in 6 months. But those supremely skilled aviators were mostly dead by June 1944. They had fallen in the skies over Midway, where 4 carriers and their irreplaceable air groupings were lost in a single day. They had died in the grinding attrition of the Solomons campaign, where daily combat over Guadalcanal bled Japanese naval aviation for months. They had perished in desperate battles across the Central Pacific as American forces island-hopped toward Japan. The Imperial Japanese Navy had never developed a systematic program for rotating experienced pilots home to serve as instructors. The veterans flew combat missions until they were killed, taking their accumulated knowledge and hard-won skills with them to the bottom of the Pacific. No institutional mechanism existed to capture their expertise and pass it to the next generation of aviators. By June 1944, Japanese pilot training had deteriorated to catastrophic levels. Severe fuel shortages imposed by American submarine attacks on Japanese tankers curtailed flight hours drastically. The rigorous pre-war selection programs that had once accepted only the most talented candidates from thousands of applicants were abandoned in favor of mass enrollment to fill empty cockpits. Experienced instructors who should have been teaching new pilots were instead sent to operational squadrons to replace combat losses, further degrading training quality. Many of the pilots aboard Ozawa's carriers had received fewer than 6 months of total flight training. Some had never successfully completed an arrested carrier landing before deploying for combat operations. American intelligence officers who interrogated captured Japanese aviators later in the war were genuinely shocked to discover that by late 1944 and into 1945, some replacement pilots entered combat with as few as 40 total flight hours. These young men could barely control their aircraft, let alone fight in them. The contrast with American naval aviation could not have been starker or more consequential. United States Navy pilot training programs required a minimum of 525 hours of flight time before any aviator could be assigned to a combat squadron. The pilots of Task Force 58, who would face Ozawa's air groups, averaged considerably more than that minimum, and a substantial number were veterans of earlier carrier battles at Coral Sea, Midway, and the Solomons. They had learned through hard experience what worked and what got pilots killed. American aviators flew aircraft designed with pilot survival as a primary consideration. The Grumman F6F Hellcat featured armor plating around the cockpit to protect the pilot from enemy fire. Its fuel tanks were self-sealing, designed to close off bullet holes automatically rather than leaking gasoline that would ignite. Its 2,000 horsepower Pratt & Whitney engine provided enough power to escape from disadvantageous situations, rather than forcing pilots to fight their way out. The aircraft was designed on the assumption that pilots would sometimes be hit, and it gave them the best possible chance of surviving to fight again. The Japanese had taken the opposite approach to aircraft design. Their Mitsubishi A6M0 fighter achieved its remarkable range and maneuverability through extreme weight reduction that eliminated pilot armor, self-sealing fuel cells, and even structural strength. A Zero that took hits would burn or break apart. This was an acceptable trade when pilots were irreplaceable masters of their craft who rarely made mistakes that resulted in taking fire. It was a catastrophically poor trade when the cockpits were filled with poorly trained novices flying against battle-hardened veterans in superior aircraft. Ozawa knew nothing about the American system of radar-directed fighter control that would doom his attacks. American carriers had developed sophisticated combat information centers where trained officers tracked incoming raids on radar screens and directed friendly fighters to intercept them while still far from the fleet. The system used radio communications to vector Hellcats to precise intercept positions, with altitude advantage over approaching enemy formations. A handful of skilled fighter direction officers could coordinate hundreds of aircraft with precision that Japanese forces, still dependent on visual observation and voice radio without centralized control, could not begin to match. When Ozawa's pilots approached Task Force 58, they would not achieve the surprise their attack plan assumed. They would fly into carefully prepared ambushes by fighters that had been positioned to destroy them. The Americans possessed another decisive advantage that Ozawa did not even suspect existed. Their anti-aircraft shells were equipped with a secret weapon designated the VT proximity fuse. Developed at the Johns Hopkins University Applied Physics Laboratory under extraordinary secrecy, these revolutionary fuses used a miniature radio transmitter and receiver built into the shell itself to detect when it passed near an aircraft. The fuse would detonate automatically at the optimal moment for maximum destructive effect, rather than requiring either an extremely lucky direct hit or a precisely timed mechanical fuse setting. The electronic components of the proximity fuse represented remarkable engineering achievements. They had to withstand acceleration forces exceeding 20,000 times the force of gravity during the instant of firing. They had to survive spinning at 25,000 rotations per minute throughout the shell's flight. They had to function reliably in the harsh conditions of naval combat. That American industry could mass-produce such sophisticated devices by the millions testified to capabilities Japanese planners had completely failed to anticipate. Conventional anti-aircraft fire using time-fused shells required precise prediction of exactly where a fast-moving aircraft would be when the shell arrived and detonated at a preset time. Against maneuvering targets, the mathematics were essentially impossible.
Perhaps one shell in 1,000 actually destroyed its intended target. Ammunition expenditure was enormous, and results were poor. Proximity-fused shells changed this equation dramatically. They proved 3 to 4 times more effective than conventional time fuses under combat conditions. In 1943, though approximately 1/4 of American anti-aircraft ammunition used the secret VT fuses, that 1/4 accounted for more than half of all enemy aircraft destroyed by naval gunfire. The Japanese pilots approaching Task Force 58 on June 19, 1944, would fly into a wall of exploding steel, far deadlier than anything they had encountered in training or imagined in their nightmares. Perhaps most critically, Ozawa and his staff completely failed to appreciate what they faced in the Grumman F6F Hellcat fighter that equipped American carrier squadrons. This aircraft had been designed specifically to counter the Mitsubishi Zero, incorporating detailed lessons learned from American pilots who had fought against Japan's legendary fighter and survived to describe precisely what made it dangerous and where its weaknesses lay. The Zero achieved its extraordinary agility through extreme weight savings that sacrificed everything for performance. The Hellcat took a fundamentally different approach. It protected the pilot with armor and provided self-sealing fuel tanks while still delivering performance superior to the Zero in the flight regimes where combat was actually decided. The Hellcat was not more maneuverable than the Zero at low speeds in a turning fight. In that narrow circumstance, the lighter Japanese fighter would win.
But American pilots were trained never to engage in low-speed turning fights against Zeros. Instead, Hellcat pilots used the altitude advantage provided by radar fighter direction to dive on Japanese formations from above, fire concentrated bursts from 6 heavy 50-caliber machine guns that could shred unarmored aircraft, and then use their superior speed in the dive and climb to escape before the more agile Zeros could turn to engage. The tactic was not elegant or sporting or romantic. It was calculated industrial-age killing, and it was devastatingly effective against opponents who had been trained for a different kind of air combat. The morning of June 19th began with American submarines delivering the first blows before any aircraft launched from either fleet. USS Albacore, commanded by Lieutenant Commander James Blanchard, had been stalking Ozawa's formation through the darkness of the previous night. At 8:10 in the morning, Blanchard maneuvered his submarine into attack position against the massive carrier Taiho, Japan's newest and most advanced fleet carrier, which had been commissioned just 3 months earlier. Blanchard faced a problem. His torpedo data computer, the mechanical calculator that determined the precise firing solution for his torpedoes, had malfunctioned during the approach. Rather than break off the attack, he ordered 6 torpedoes fired, using visual estimation of the target's course and speed, spreading them across Taiho's projected track to maximize the probability of at least one hitting. What happened next entered the permanent records of Japanese naval sacrifice and heroism. Warrant Officer Sakio Kamamatsu, piloting a Yokosuka D-4Y dive bomber that had just launched from Taiho's flight deck, spotted the white torpedo wake streaking toward his ship through the clear Pacific water below. Without a moment's hesitation, Kamamatsu pushed his aircraft into a steep dive directly toward one of the incoming torpedoes. He deliberately crashed his plane into its path, sacrificing himself and his crew to protect their carrier. The aircraft and torpedo exploded together in a fountain of spray and debris. It was an act of extraordinary courage that reduced the number of torpedoes reaching Taiho from 6 to 5. But one torpedo was enough. A single weapon struck Taiho's starboard side, rupturing aviation fuel storage tanks and jamming the forward aircraft elevator in its raised position, which created a gap in the armored flight deck. The damage initially appeared manageable to the ship's officers. Taiho maintained near-flank speed and continued launching and recovering aircraft for the morning strikes.
Captain Toshikazu Omi, serving as Ozawa's chief of staff, believed the situation was under control, but the ruptured fuel tanks were steadily leaking volatile aviation gasoline into the ship's interior, and an inexperienced damage control officer made a decision that would prove catastrophically fatal. Intending to clear the dangerous fumes from the ship, he ordered the ventilation system open to maximum power. Instead of venting the gasoline vapors safely overboard, the fans spread them throughout Taiho's enclosed interior spaces. By noon, both hangar decks were saturated with invisible explosive fumes. Japan's newest carrier had become a floating bomb, waiting for the slightest spark to ignite it. 3 hours after Blanchard's attack on Taiho, another American submarine found another Japanese carrier, presenting an irresistible target. USS Kavala, commanded by Lieutenant Commander Herman Kostler, was conducting her very first war patrol. Kostler had patiently tracked the fleet carrier Shokaku through his periscope as she maneuvered to recover aircraft returning from the morning strike. Shokaku was one of the most famous warships in the Japanese fleet, a Pearl Harbor veteran that had been among the 6 carriers launching the December 7th attack that brought America into the war. She had fought at the Coral Sea, at the Eastern Solomons, at Santa Cruz. She was among the most battle-tested carriers afloat. At 18 minutes 11, Kostler fired 6 torpedoes from a range of 1,200 yards. 3 struck Shokaku's starboard side in rapid succession. 1 torpedo hit the forward aviation fuel tanks. Another detonated in the vicinity of the forward bomb storage magazines. Aircraft that were still in the process of being refueled on the hangar deck exploded into flames as burning aviation gasoline from ruptured fuel lines rained down on the damage control parties, desperately trying to contain the spreading fires. Within minutes, uncontrollable conflagrations were spreading through multiple compartments. By early afternoon, flames were visibly spouting from Shokaku's flight deck. At 8 minutes past 2 in the afternoon, bombs in the forward magazines detonated in a massive internal explosion that broke the carrier's back. Shokaku sank in approximately 3 minutes, taking over 1,260 officers and men with her to the bottom, including nearly 400 aircrew who had just returned from the morning strikes. It was the worst single-ship casualty in the history of Japan's carrier striking force. Ozawa, still aboard the stricken Taiho, did not yet know his fleet had lost 2 carriers to submarine attack within hours. He remained focused on the airstrikes he had launched against the American fleet, beginning at 30 minutes 8 that morning, still confident that his carefully planned operation was unfolding successfully. The first Japanese raid consisted of 68 aircraft, mostly Mitsubishi A6M0 fighters, escorting Yokosuka D4Y dive bombers and Nakajima B6N JIL torpedo planes. They flew in disciplined formation toward the coordinates where Japanese scout aircraft had reported the American fleet. The pilots had been briefed on their targets and attack procedures. They believed they would catch the Americans by surprise and inflict devastating damage. They did not know that every mile of their approach was being tracked on glowing green radar screens aboard American ships still over 100 miles away. Aboard USS Lexington, Vice Admiral Marc Mitscher's flagship, Lieutenant Joseph Edgott served as fighter director officer in the ship's Combat Information Center. Edgott had trained extensively for exactly this situation. When radar operators reported the incoming Japanese raid at extreme range, Edgott had time to launch every available Hellcat and vector them into optimal intercept positions well before the enemy could reach the fleet. He broadcast the traditional fighter scramble call, and within 15 minutes, over 200 Hellcats were airborne, climbing hard for altitude and heading west to meet the incoming Japanese. The fighters were stacked at different altitudes and positioned to attack from above and behind, exactly where the poorly trained Japanese pilots would be most vulnerable. Lieutenant Junior Grade Charles Sims provided EDGOT with an additional invaluable advantage that amplified the radar information.
Sims was a Japanese language specialist stationed in Lexington's Combat Information Center, specifically to monitor enemy radio frequencies. As the Japanese air coordinator directed his pilots toward the American fleet, Sims listened to every transmission in real time, translating the information and relaying it immediately to EDGOT. The Americans knew the incoming formation's altitude, heading, composition, and tactical intentions before the Japanese pilots could even see the ships they were supposed to attack. Lieutenant Commander Charles Brewer of Fighting Squadron 15, flying from the carrier USS Essex, led the first group of Hellcats to make contact with the incoming Japanese raid. He found the enemy formation approximately 55 miles from Task Force 58, still well beyond visual range of the carriers and other ships his pilots were defending. The Japanese were flying in tight formation, presenting perfect targets for diving attacks from above. Brewer immediately led his fighters into the attack. He lined up the enemy formation leader close to approximately 800 feet directly behind his target and sent the Japanese aircraft spinning into the sea with a single accurate burst from his 6 machine guns. Without pausing to watch it fall, Brewer selected another target and destroyed it within seconds, then another. In rapid succession, he shot down 4 enemy aircraft before Japanese fighters could effectively respond to the sudden assault from above and behind. The methodical destruction that followed gave the Battle of the Philippine Sea its enduring nickname. American pilots found themselves attacking formations of poorly trained Japanese aviators who struggled desperately to maintain formation cohesion under the unexpected onslaught. The Japanese pilots fought with courage, but individual courage could not compensate for inadequate training when facing superior aircraft flown by veterans who had been positioned for perfect attacks by radar direction. Lieutenant Junior Grade Alexander Vraciu of Fighting Squadron 16 demonstrated with particular clarity what a skilled Hellcat pilot could accomplish against inadequately trained opponents in inferior aircraft. Despite an engine malfunction that sprayed oil across his windscreen and limited his maximum altitude to 20,000 feet, Vraciu dove into a formation of Judy dive bombers heading for the American carriers. In just 8 minutes of concentrated combat, he shot down 6 enemy aircraft using only 360 rounds of ammunition from his total load of 2,400 rounds, an average of approximately 60 bullets per kill. It was a display of aerial marksmanship that reflected years of training and natural talent. When Vraciu landed on Lexington after his second sortie of the day, he climbed from his cockpit and held up 6 fingers for the ship's photographer, grinning broadly. The resulting image of the young pilot displaying his score became one of the iconic photographs of the entire Pacific War. Admiral Mitscher, watching from his flag bridge high above the flight deck, permitted himself a rare smile at the sight. In the ready room below, Vraciu described what he had witnessed during the aerial combat. All of a sudden, the battle was over, he recalled years later. I looked around at the sky, and all I could see were Hellcats flying in every direction and pieces of Japanese airplanes falling into the water. The third Japanese raid of 47 aircraft achieved essentially nothing. Intercepted approximately 50 miles from the American fleet, only 7 aircraft were shot down, but the majority of the remainder became hopelessly disoriented in the chaos of combat and subsequent evasive maneuvering. They returned to their carriers without pressing any attacks on American ships. Their poorly trained pilots had lost formation integrity, lost their bearings, and could not locate the enemy fleet through the scattered clouds. The fourth and final raid of approximately 82 aircraft suffered perhaps the cruelest fate of all. Staff officers aboard Ozawa's carriers made a critical error in calculating the current position of the American fleet based on earlier scouting reports, and they provided incorrect coordinates to the strike leader. The Japanese formation flew to where the Americans were supposed to be according to the erroneous navigation data and found only empty ocean. By the time the error was recognized and the pilots began searching for their actual targets, fuel was running critically low.
49 aircraft from the 4th Raid attempted to land on the airfield at Orod on Guam to refuel before either continuing their attack or returning to their carriers. They had been told the base would be ready to receive them with fuel, ammunition, and maintenance support. Instead, they discovered that American bombing had cratered the runways and that Hellcat fighters were waiting in ambush above the field, specifically positioned to prevent exactly what Ozawa's shuttle bombing plan required. American pilots had maintained continuous combat air patrols over Guam throughout the day for precisely this purpose. When the 4th Raid's exhausted survivors approached Oroder Field in their fuel-starved aircraft, they flew directly into a carefully prepared slaughter. 97 of the 107 Japanese aircraft were destroyed. Only 10 damaged survivors made it back to their carriers to report the disaster. Commander David McCampbell, leading Air Group 15 from Essex, achieved the most devastating individual performance of the day. Encountering a large formation of approximately 80 enemy aircraft, McCampbell led his fighters in repeated diving attacks through the Japanese formation. In a single extended engagement that morning, he personally destroyed 5 Yokosuka D-4Y dive bombers in rapid succession, becoming an ace in a single sortie. Later that afternoon, flying a second mission over Guam where surviving Japanese aircraft were attempting to land and refuel, he added 2 more Mitsubishi Zeros to his score. McCampbell's 7 confirmed kills in a single day made him the Navy's leading ace of the batter. His Medal of Honor citation would note that he struck fiercely in valiant defense of our surface force. By November of 1944, continuing to fly combat missions in subsequent operations, McCampbell would accumulate 34 confirmed aerial victories, the highest total achieved by any American Navy pilot during a single combat deployment in the entire war. Lieutenant Junior Grade Alexander Vraciu of Fighting Squadron 16 demonstrated with particular clarity what a skilled Hellcat pilot could accomplish against inadequately trained opponents in inferior aircraft. Despite an engine malfunction that sprayed oil across his windscreen and limited his maximum altitude to 20,000 feet, Vraciu dove into a formation of Judy dive bombers heading for the American carriers. In just 8 minutes of concentrated combat, he shot down 6 enemy aircraft, using only 360 rounds of ammunition from his total load of 2,400 rounds, an average of approximately 60 bullets per kill. It was a display of aerial marksmanship that reflected years of training and natural talent. When Vraciu landed on Lexington after his second sortie of the day, he climbed from his cockpit and held up 6 fingers for the ship's photographer, grinning broadly. The resulting image of the young pilot displaying his score became one of the iconic photographs of the entire Pacific War. Admiral Mitscher, watching from his flag bridge high above the flight deck, permitted himself a rare smile at the sight. In the ready room below, Vraciu described what he had witnessed during the aerial combat. All of a sudden, the battle was over, he recalled years later. I looked around at the sky, and all I could see were Hellcats flying in every direction and pieces of Japanese airplanes falling into the water. The third Japanese raid of 47 aircraft achieved essentially nothing. Intercepted approximately 50 miles from the American fleet, only 7 aircraft were shot down, but the majority of the remainder became hopelessly disoriented in the chaos of combat and subsequent evasive maneuvering. They returned to their carriers without pressing any attacks on American ships. Their poorly trained pilots had lost formation integrity, lost their bearings, and could not locate the enemy fleet through the scattered clouds. The fourth and final raid of approximately 82 aircraft suffered perhaps the cruelest fate of all. Staff officers aboard Ozawa's carriers made a critical error in calculating the current position of the American fleet based on earlier scouting reports, and they provided incorrect coordinates to the strike leader. The Japanese formation flew to where the Americans were supposed to be according to the erroneous navigation data and found only empty ocean. By the time the error was recognized and the pilots began searching for their actual targets, fuel was running critically low. 49 aircraft from the 4th Raid attempted to land on the airfield at O-Road on Guam to refuel before either continuing their attack or returning to their carriers. They had been told the base would be ready to receive them with fuel, ammunition, and maintenance support. Instead, they discovered that American bombing had cratered the runways and that Hellcat fighters were waiting in ambush above the field, specifically positioned to prevent exactly what Ozawa's shuttle bombing plan required. American pilots had maintained continuous combat air patrols over Guam throughout the day for precisely this purpose. When the 4th Raid's exhausted survivors approached O-Rotor Field in their fuel-starved aircraft, they flew directly into a carefully prepared slaughter. 97 of the 107 Japanese aircraft were destroyed. Only 10 damaged survivors made it back to their carriers to report the disaster. Commander David McCampbell, leading Air Group 15 from Essex, achieved the most devastating individual performance of the day. Encountering a large formation,
The handful of survivors who managed to crash land on the damaged airstrips found their aircraft too badly damaged by the rough landings to ever fly again. Not a single aircraft from the 4th Japanese Raid would ever return to Ozawa's carriers. Among the American pilots killed during the fighting over Guam was Commander Charles Brewer himself, the squadron leader who had made first contact with the incoming raids that morning and opened the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot with his devastating initial attack. Pressing his attacks aggressively at low altitude against Japanese aircraft attempting to land, Brewer lost the altitude advantage that had protected American pilots throughout the day. Several Zeros caught him from behind before he could climb away. The brave officer who had led the first successful interception did not survive to see the conclusion of the battle he had helped begin. His Navy Cross was awarded posthumously. By sunset on June 19th, Ozawa had lost approximately 350 carrier aircraft out of the 373 he had launched in his 4 major strikes. American combat losses totaled just 23 aircraft. The exchange ratio exceeded 15-1 in favor of the defenders. Then came the long-delayed catastrophe aboard the carrier Taiho. At 32 minutes past 2 that afternoon, the aviation gasoline vapors that had been silently spreading through the ship since the morning torpedo hit finally found their source of ignition. The resulting explosion was devastating. It buckled the armored flight deck upward and blew out the sides of the enclosed aircraft hangars. Secondary explosions followed in rapid succession as aviation ordnance and fuel stores detonated throughout the stricken ship. At 28 minutes past 4 in the afternoon, Taiho, the newest and most sophisticated carrier in the entire Japanese fleet, the ship commissioned just 3 months earlier that was supposed to represent the future of Japanese naval aviation, rolled onto her beams and slipped beneath the Philippine Sea. Approximately 660 officers and enlisted men went down with their ship, including many of the highly skilled aircraft mechanics, ordnance handlers, and flight deck personnel that the Japanese naval aviation establishment could never adequately replace. Ozawa had already transferred his flag to a destroyer as Taiho began her death throes. He then made his way by small boat to the carrier Shokaku, one of his few undamaged flight decks. Throughout these transfers, he remained convinced that his aircraft had inflicted serious damage on the American fleet, and that the survivors had landed safely on Guam to refuel, rearm, and prepare for further attacks the following day, as his operational plan had envisioned. Only when Ozawa finally reached Shokaku's flag bridge and received accurate reports from his remaining air group commanders did he begin to comprehend the true magnitude of the disaster that had befallen Japanese naval aviation. Of the 430 carrier aircraft with which he had begun that morning's operations, only 35 remained operational as darkness fell. His air groups had been annihilated. His carefully conceived plan had failed completely. The decisive battle he had sought had indeed proven decisive, but not in any way he had anticipated. The following day, June 20th, brought further losses to Ozawa's retreating fleet, though under circumstances that tested American resolve as severely as Japanese courage. American search aircraft finally located Ozawa's surviving carriers at 15 minutes past 3 in the afternoon, approximately 300 miles to the west, and moving away at high speed toward the relative safety of the Western Pacific. The tactical situation presented Mitscher with an agonizing decision. 300 miles was extreme range for a carrier strike. The late afternoon hour meant that pilots would have to return after darkness had fallen. The vast majority of American naval aviators had never attempted a night carrier landing, which was considered one of the most dangerous maneuvers in all of aviation, even for pilots who had trained specifically for it. Launching a strike under these conditions meant that many aircraft would return in total darkness to find their carriers, and significant numbers might be lost to fuel exhaustion or landing accidents. Mitscher studied the tactical situation on his plotting board for only a few minutes before giving his order: "Get the carriers." 240 aircraft launched from 11 American carriers between 10 and 30 minutes past 4 that afternoon, racing west toward Ozawa's position. Shortly after the strike was airborne, a corrected position report from the scout planes revealed that the Japanese fleet was actually even farther away than initially calculated. Located over 330 miles distant and still retreating, the pilots would be operating at the absolute limit of their fuel endurance, with virtually no margin for error. Mitscher considered the new information and chose not to recall the strike. The American attack achieved results that seemed modest compared to the previous day's aerial massacre. The carrier Ho was torpedoed and sunk with approximately 250 of her crew. The carriers Shokaku, Juno, and Chiyoda sustained bomb damage but remained afloat and capable of further operations. 2 irreplaceable fleet oilers were destroyed, further crippling Japanese operational mobility. 20 American aircraft fell to Japanese fighters and anti-aircraft fire during the attack itself. Then came the desperate return flight that tested everything American naval aviation had built and believed about itself. As fuel gauges throughout the returning air groups dropped steadily toward empty in total darkness, pilots searched with increasing desperation for their carriers. They had launched with full knowledge that the mission was at the extreme limit of fuel endurance. Now that theoretical risk became terrifying reality, as engine after engine coughed, sputtered, and died across miles of black Pacific Ocean. At approximately 30 minutes past 8 that evening, Mitscher stood on his flag bridge, watching the darkness, and made the decision that would define his legacy as a naval commander. "Turn on the lights," he ordered quietly. The order violated every fundamental principle of naval operations in waters where enemy submarines were known to be operating. Illuminating the entire fleet made every ship a clearly visible target silhouetted against the dark ocean. Standing orders from Admiral Chester Nimitz commanding the entire Pacific Fleet specifically prohibited exactly this kind of dangerous exposure to submarine attack. Mitscher gave the order anyway. Every ship in Task Force 58 turned on its running lights simultaneously. Powerful searchlights pointed toward the sky to create beacons visible for miles across the water. Star shells burst overhead at intervals, bathing the sea in harsh artificial light. Destroyers on the fleet perimeter fired parachute illumination flares. Individual sailors throughout the task force lined the rails with handheld flashlights, waving them toward the darkness where their pilots were running out of fuel and hope. One aviator who witnessed the stunning spectacle from his cockpit as he approached the fleet later described the scene as resembling a carnival or Mardi Gras celebration in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. Lieutenant Commander Robert Winston, watching from one of the carriers as the lights came on across the entire formation, recalled the moment vividly for the rest of his life. The men stood open-mouthed for several seconds at the sheer audacity of asking the enemy submarines to come and get us, he said. Then a spontaneous cheer went up from sailors across every ship. To hell with the submarines around us. Our boys were not expendable. The subsequent night recovery operations devolved into controlled chaos that pushed naval aviation to its absolute limits. Pilots running on empty fuel tanks attempted approaches on any ship that appeared to have a flight deck, regardless of whether it was their assigned carrier or even a carrier at all. Exhausted aviators misjudged distances in the darkness, missed arresting wires, and crashed into barriers. 18 aircraft were completely destroyed in deck landing accidents. Others ditched deliberately alongside destroyers when their engines finally quit, their pilots gambling that rescue boats would reach them before sharks did. Of approximately 100 aircraft lost during the June 20th mission, 80 were lost to fuel exhaustion, ditching, and landing accidents rather than to enemy action. The skill and technology that had massacred Japanese formations the previous day could not overcome the fundamental physical limitations of fuel and darkness. But the rescue efforts that followed over the next 48 hours demonstrated values that distinguished American military culture. Destroyers and float planes scoured hundreds of square miles of ocean, searching for survivors. Pilots who had ditched in darkness were located by their dive markers and signal mirrors when daylight returned. 143 of the 185 aviators forced into the sea were recovered alive by persistent rescue efforts. 49 American airmen did not come home from the mission beyond darkness, but Mitscher had demonstrated in the most dramatic way possible that the United States Navy would accept extraordinary risks to bring its people back alive. Ozawa retreated toward Okinawa with the shattered remnants of what had been a powerful fleet. The decisive engagement he had expected would turn the tide of the Pacific War had instead destroyed Japanese naval aviation as an effective fighting force for the remainder of the conflict. The intensive training programs that had produced elite aviators in the years before Pearl Harbor could not be reconstituted under the pressures Japan now faced. The nation lacked sufficient fuel for adequate flight training, lacked experienced instructors to teach new pilots, and lacked the time necessary to rebuild what had been destroyed. The strategic consequences of the Philippine Sea disaster cascaded rapidly through every aspect of the Japanese war effort. Within weeks of the defeat, Prime Minister Hideki Tojo's government collapsed from power, replaced by leaders who privately understood that the war was essentially lost, but could not identify any path to an acceptable peace. At the Battle of Leyte Gulf, just 4 months later, Ozawa's surviving carriers were deliberately employed as sacrificial decoys, openly exposed to draw American carrier forces away from the Philippine landing beaches so that Japanese surface ships might attack the vulnerable transports. The carriers that sorted for Leyte Gulf carried only 108 operational aircraft among 6 ships, a pitiful fraction of former strength. Ozawa went into that engagement fully expecting and accepting that his force would be destroyed because serving as a sacrificial distraction was the only remaining useful function his depleted carriers could perform. The decoy mission succeeded in drawing Admiral Halsey's carriers north, but it marked the final combat operation of the Imperial Japanese Navy's carrier force. The first organized kamikaze suicide attacks began at Leyte Gulf in October 1944, representing an explicit institutional acknowledgement that Japanese pilots could no longer effectively compete against Americans in conventional aerial combat. Sending young men to deliberately crash their explosive-laden aircraft into enemy ships was not a tactic any nation would choose if viable alternatives existed. By the spring of 1945, kamikaze pilot training had been compressed to approximately 7 days of instruction. Recruits learned to take off, fly in basic formation toward a target, and execute a terminal dive. They did not need to learn how to land their aircraft because they were never expected to return. The Marianas Islands that American forces secured in the immediate wake of the Philippine Sea victory became the primary launching platforms for the strategic bombing campaign that devastated the Japanese home islands. B-29 Superfortress bombers operating from bases on Saipan, Tinian, and Guam brought the full destructive power of American industry directly to Japanese cities. The catastrophic firebombing of Tokyo in March 1945 and the atomic attacks on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August launched from runways that American construction battalions began building within weeks of the carrier battle. The lesson of what happened on June 19th and 20th, 1944, extends far beyond the specific tactical and operational details of naval warfare. Ozawa and the Japanese High Command made exactly the same catastrophic analytical error that military and political leaders have repeated throughout recorded history. They measured their enemy by what they expected and wanted to find, rather than by what actually existed in reality. They saw American industrial capacity and assumed that mere quantity could never compensate for Japanese fighting spirit and warrior tradition. They remembered the supremely skilled elite aviators who had swept victoriously through the Pacific in 1941 and completely failed to recognize that those exceptional men were dead, replaced by undertrained novices flying into a technological trap. Their commanders did not understand and had not prepared them to survive. The Americans that Ozawa's pilots faced in June 1944 were not the same Americans who had struggled through the desperate early months of the Pacific War. 2.5 years of continuous combat produced pilots who knew their aircraft intimately, understood their enemy's specific weaknesses, and had learned through hard and bloody experience precisely how to survive and kill. The industrial might that Japanese planners had dismissed as mere quantity produced revolutionary weapons that transformed quantity into decisive qualitative advantage. Radar provided warning. Proximity fuses multiplied anti-aircraft effectiveness. Manifold engines, the Hellcat fighter dominated every engagement. The sophisticated organizational systems that coordinated hundreds of aircraft simultaneously through combat information centers achieved levels of precision that Japanese forces could not approach. Ozawa sailed into battle believing that traditional Japanese spirit would triumph over American machines and material. He discovered that spirit, however sincere and however bravely
demonstrated by individual pilots, could not compensate for aviators who lacked the training to survive against a thoroughly prepared enemy flying superior aircraft in coordinated tactics. Thank you for watching.